Well, the Ohio State Buckeyes coming off a big win against the Rutgers Scarlet Knights this past weekend. Ohio State obviously has played really well these last couple of games, but with teams in front of them in this national top 10 losing, and with Ole Miss even at number 12 losing, how does this past weekend impact Ohio State's national championship hopes? Are they a legitimate contender? Does Oregon's loss help or hurt the Buckeyes? We've got plenty to talk about here this afternoon. Buckeye Breakdown coming up next here, Buckeyes Now on Sports Illustrated. We've got the whole crew together as we cover Ohio State with our instant analysis from Ohio State.
There's something that doesn't feel right.
Unbelievable effort from him today. Is E.J. Liddell going to crack the first team All Big Ten?
I think he can be the guy. I'm not trying to start a quarterback controversy.
He seems to have the durability. He certainly has the toughness. This is the question on a lot of people's minds here. Welcome to Buckeye Breakdown. What's going on, everybody? I'm Brendan Gulick along with Brett Hiltbrand. This is Buckeye Breakdown on Monday as the Buckeyes have just wrapped up a nice win over Rutgers and are preparing for Maryland here this upcoming weekend. Brett, we've talked ad nauseum off air about all of the fallout here around college football, and certainly with what Ohio State did this past weekend. But I think it's time to dive into some of that on air. We have certainly covered the Ohio State Rutgers game with a fine-tooth comb, but it's time to talk a little bit about the national picture and how Ohio State right now is fitting in as we, believe it or not, are about to play the 6th out of 12 games during the regular season. We are almost halfway through the college football season. It's kind of crazy to think about. So as we dive into that conversation, what are your general thoughts about right now where Ohio State sits at 7th in the national polls?
Yeah, I think they're in about as good of a position as they could have hoped for following that defeat to Oregon and then their performance the next week and how rocky that looked at times. I think it's probably best case scenario a little bit in that these last 2 weeks, obviously the competition is a factor, but the last 2 weeks they've looked, kind of like the Ohio State we've expected from them. And you couple that with some dominoes falling in their way and some maybe not over the last 2 weeks as well. And it's, things are looking pretty good. I think all things considered, Ohio State's in a decent position, especially if things kind of, turn out the way we expect them to between now and say that Michigan game at the end of November. I think, they're in a position now to be able to kind of achieve the goals that they're looking to achieve for sure.
I think there's been all this talk about playoff expansion, but none of it was going to happen for this season. It's all about looking forward and hopefully in the immediate future. But boy, considering what's gone on in 2021, I think the potential ultimate example of why playoff expansion is needed, and I would argue was needed right from the beginning. I've never liked a 14 playoff. I think this might just be the year and the scenario. You've got two teams right now in Alabama and Georgia that kind of look like they're playing in their own mini version of the NFL this year, just throttling teams. I mean, I realized one of the games was Vanderbilt. Okay. Vanderbilt's not a great football program, but what Georgia just did to Arkansas this past weekend is really eye-opening. I realize Georgia's offense isn't riveting right now. I know Stetson Bennett played quarterback instead of JT Daniels this past weekend. Arkansas's defense is very, very good, and Georgia eviscerated them. Alabama has done that to every opponent they've played so far, including a couple of Power 5 programs. And everybody likes to, rag on them for playing some early season cupcake games too. But, they did it right away against Miami. So Alabama and Georgia right now, to me, and I think to a lot of national folks, look like clear-cut teams that belong in the playoff and should take care of business the rest of the way. But after that, Cincinnati, I realize Indiana isn't right now what they've been in years, in this past year. But look at who Indiana's lost to. Lost to Iowa, they've lost to Cincinnati, and they've lost to Iowa State, who are all very good teams. And they play Penn State this weekend. I'm sorry, Iowa plays Penn State this weekend. Indiana still has to play Penn State. So I got to play the Buckeyes. I mean, I think Indiana's a decent team, despite the fact they haven't been what they were last year. And Cincinnati goes to Bloomington and beats them. And then the Bearcats, frankly, kind of pounded Notre Dame this weekend. I realize the scoreboard wasn't a whopping margin. If you watch that game, it wasn't close. It was all Cincinnati. So Notre Dame loses. Arkansas gets blown out. Ole Miss is reasonably competitive in the end of the game, but they got smoked. And Oregon loses to Stanford, who's been the hardest team in America to figure out this year because they've got a couple good wins and a couple of horrendous losses. So now all of a sudden you look at it from an Ohio State perspective and think, gee, that loss to Oregon, which was only a 7-point loss with a really young team. I mean, I think the Buckeyes legitimately could be a college football playoff contender. I've said all along it's an uphill climb, but now we're looking at a situation where they've got a realistic chance. And yet, if there were 6 or 8 teams that make the playoffs, you could probably punch your ticket now.
Yeah, I think, you're absolutely right. I think in general, it does look like Georgia, Alabama, and everyone else, right? And I think in the idea of like an expanded college football playoff situation, like those are the 2 teams that get byes in that first round, right? And so I'm always like open to that conversation because in my mind, the college football playoff really, I think everybody, it's like, it's a good example of like, grass being, is not always greener, right? I think everyone kind of lamented the BCS and the computers and all of that. And, the algorithms and how all that sometimes could churn out. And then the college football playoff happens. And then we get a couple scenarios where it's like, well, this doesn't work either. Right. And so, I'm always open a little bit to the conversation, but I, as far as expanding it, but I've also seen in my mind, it's like, do we really need to see, like UCF jump in and get destroyed by Alabama in the first round of a expanded college football playoff? Now that like, I would argue maybe not, obviously you still have to play the game, right? But like, I think there's room to grow. I think there's, room for nuance a little bit. And I think if you expand it to multiple teams, you then I'll have to kind of extend a little bit of leeway, of leash, right? Of trying to feel out what works and what doesn't. And I see like a lot of the comments here, Wisconsin is bad. Someone said Arkansas isn't that good.
That's false. Arkansas is a very good football team.
Yeah, Arkansas, I don't know. Arkansas is pretty darn good. But I think in general right now, if you're looking at this from the kind of the side of Ohio State, essentially to be the AP top 25, I want to say they're 7th. Yeah, 7th in AP, and in front of them, in between, say 1, 2, that's Bama, Georgia. So you have Iowa 3, Penn State 4, Cincy 5, Oklahoma 6. Ohio State's better than all of those teams, with the exception maybe of Oklahoma. And
I think Oklahoma's really vulnerable this year. I know they haven't lost, but like they look like they're about to lose almost every game they play.
I think that actually kind of helps them in the long run too, that knowing that they essentially don't have the same firepower to blow everyone out. But I think their floor is a lot higher than those other teams. And then you're talking about like the coaches of those respective teams. The only one I like more than Lincoln Riley is Luke Fickell. And so, but I love it's like the Chaos Elmo gif, right? Like I love the situation that we're in right now and how it's all kind of shaking out, because it's very, very obvious this year that there's like a handful of programs that are raising their level, and then there's a big gap. And then there's another tier. And we're talking about Ohio State, Clemson, Georgia, Alabama, those 4. And Clemson, I think, Clemson is like kind of on the edge right now, because you're seeing what they look like when they don't have Trevor Lawrence at quarterback.
I mean, they should have lost to Boston College.
100%.
Boston College had them by the throat and just couldn't finish a game.
Yeah, so I really think if you're making the case for expanding the playoff, in a lot of ways you're doing that to protect those top tier teams in order to get, say, the best national championship. This season is really proving to be a really great example of why that's maybe needed.
All right, let's address this just head on. Is Ohio State a legitimate national championship contender? I think it's a good question to ask because we've got enough of a sample size now with this team. If you have followed Ohio State with any sliver of attention throughout the course of the year, you are obviously well aware of how young this team is and how often that's been said. But by 5 weeks in, a lot of those young guys, or perhaps the better way to say it, the inexperienced players, those guys have a bunch of reps now. And you can see progression from where Ohio State was against Minnesota and Oregon to where they were these last 2 weeks. I am absolutely willing to acknowledge the talent gap between Ohio State and Akron. You saw that at the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball all game long, especially on defense where Ohio State had 9 sacks and 12 tackles for loss. It might not show up statistically at the line of scrimmage against Rutgers, because Noah Vedral did a good job of getting the ball out, but he was constantly under duress. The Buckeyes picked him off 3 times after he hadn't thrown an interception in 4 games. Obviously returned 1 for a touchdown. And the offense, when the first team group was out there, 7 possessions, they scored 7 times, including an early field goal. This team clearly is taking good strides forward without a sliver of a doubt. CJ Stroud had his best game as a Buckeye this past week. We'd seen little glimpses of what he could be in the first 4 games. I guess really for him, it was the first 3 games. Mm-hmm. But finally, he put it all together this past week with his shoulder, supposedly not bothering him anymore. There's reason to see some of this momentum, despite the fact that the competition wasn't quite what you are hoping for these last 2 weeks. That said, I still stand by this. Rutgers is a better team than they've been in years past. I think Ohio State just played that well this weekend. You're going to play a Maryland team that is top 25 in the country in total offense. I know they're coming off of a miserable game, but the Buckeyes should win, you would think, fairly handily against Maryland and go into the bye. And then you're looking at a first half of the season where you could be 5-1, feeling really good, and you've got teams in front of you that you would have to necessarily knock off to get into the playoff. So are the Buckeyes on Alabama and Georgia's level? I don't think that's fair yet. But are the Buckeyes a legitimate national championship contender? Can they get to the college football playoff and make a run? I say yes. I think it's getting to that point where they can do it. After 2 weeks, I'm not sure I believed that. But after 5 games and seeing the improvement on this team, yeah, I think it is very possible.
Right, and you have to also kind of apply the scenario, right, of how essentially Ohio State would have to win a national championship, what they would have to do. So we're talking about you have to beat either Georgia or Alabama in the title game, but you don't have to beat both, right? Because those 2 teams are probably playing each other. So I think there's a scenario there where, if you're saying like if Ohio State has to run through Georgia and Bama to win a title, the answer is no. The answer is unequivocally no. But to have to beat one of those teams, yeah, absolutely. And I think offensively they certainly have the firepower to be able to do that. I think there's still some questions on defense that I think I would like to see at the very least partially answered before we even get to that, time of the year. But I do think they're poised in a lot of ways to show the rest of the college football landscape essentially that, the mistakes that were made in both the defeat to Oregon and then, the rough game against Tulsa, that they're rectifying those, and then they beat everyone that they have to beat. And so I think, you have to play well, obviously, the rest of the way. You have to smash the teams that you're supposed to smash. But it's Are they poised to be able to, kind of enter that conversation? Absolutely. In a lot of ways, I think they're in a better position than some of the unbeaten teams that sit in between them and Georgia, Bama.
Part of this transitions to our topic around the Big Ten here of, Iowa, Penn State, and Michigan. Are they for real? The good news for the Buckeyes is that, they've got Penn State on their schedule in a few weeks. If things continue the way that Ohio State expects and the way the Big Ten is shaping up, you could very realistically see a Ohio State-Iowa game for the Big Ten championship. So, those two games could be de facto playoff elimination games.
Exactly.
And the same could be said for, a potential matchup with Michigan. So before we get more into the Big Ten side of things, I'll just keep this on Ohio State for a second. I think some of the changes that obviously needed to be made after the Oregon loss were, more on the scheme and the coaching side of things. And we've seen a guy like Ronnie Hickman, who has been a complete monster defensively. Mm-hmm. He's emerged as a great player. Look at Denzel Burke right now. I mean, if this kid isn't the best freshman cornerback in the country, I don't know who is. He's unbelievable. And I would be stunned at this point if he's not a freshman All-American. Bryson Shaw was pretty bad through the first two games. He's taken some really, really good steps forward these last three games now. Tommy Eichenberg got a ton of flack through the first 3 weeks. I thought Tommy Eichenberg has played better. Hopefully the injury to Cody Simon, whatever that injury is, the Buckeyes don't talk about those things. Hopefully it's not a serious injury. He's had to leave the last two games now. Cody Simon's obviously emerging as a good linebacker. What we've seen now from some of these interior defensive linemen is what you need to see if you're going to make a deep run. Haskell Garrett and Tyleik Williams in particular. Teron Vincent's playing a little bit better. You've obviously got good play so far from JTT and from Jack Sawyer on the edge, but Zach Harrison had a nice game. Javonte Jean-Baptiste had a nice game. So I do think we're seeing some noticeable improvements on the defensive side that are not just because of who you're playing. If you always judge yourself based on the level of competition, it's hard to get a real read on exactly where you're making progress and where you're not. But I do think the Buckeyes as a whole defensively are starting to play well enough that they can win the Big Ten. And if they win the Big Ten, they've got a really good chance to make the college football playoff even with one loss.
For sure. And I also think too, like what essentially what we're talking about on the defensive side of the ball is like, what does getting better look like when you roll out of bed and you're already better than the team that you're playing, And so for me, it's more of like an intangible thing. What's the intensity level? Are you maintaining that even though you're absolutely smashing a team? Are you taking opportunities to keep the pedal down? Is your energy level sustained at an extremely high level? Are you not making, are you not giving up, are you preventing chunk plays? Are you, forcing turnovers in scenarios that are probably like 50-50 kind of 50-50 plays, right? And I think Ohio State's done that now a lot over the last 2 weeks. And I think that shows me two things. One, I think it's rectified some of the problems that we saw schematically in Oregon. And I think as a byproduct of that, you're seeing guys with a lot more confidence. And I think Bryson Shaw is by far the best example of that. The other part too is, so you essentially fixed the scheme and now guys are flying around and playing a lot more natural, right? And what does that defense look like, when guys are both confident and free? The other thing too is that now you're starting to see the next step beyond what happens with confidence. And that is the belief that you can always kind of find an extra gear. And that extra gear is a lot of times we're talking about like maybe 5 or 10% more effort, 5 or 10%, a little bit more intensity. That gap is like the gap between, say, like Bama, Georgia, and everyone else, right? So if you don't have 11 5-star guys out on the field, that's fine. If you're able to maintain that 5 or 10% more of an intensity level, you're maybe able to rise above, say, your potential or like what would be like your floor, right? So that's huge. I think, and I think we've seen that. I think it would be unfair to say that like, okay, now we've checked that box. Let's now Ohio State's is good, and winning a title is definitely a possibility. I think that's probably disingenuous, but so there's obviously a lot more that you want to see. But what they've done, and which is not an easy thing to do, by the way, what they've been able to do these last 2 weeks by changing a lot of different things is schematically has really shown up on the field. And I think you're seeing from a body language standpoint, the players are really eating that up and feeling exceptionally confident. And that's only a good thing for Ohio State.
Monitoring the comments as best we can here along the way. And certainly if you have questions, please ask. We'll do our best to address those along the way. But I want to bring this up here. Arcade, I appreciate that. Thank you. It's something I try to take a lot of pride in. I never like to take pot shots at coaches or players. It's not my style. I would much rather ask an open-ended question when we're in a press conference. I think coaches are much more likely to give you good answers if you ask good questions. And there are certainly some, good questions asked during the course of lengthy press conferences. But I appreciate you saying that. That's something I take a lot of pride in. I've also seen a couple of things on here about confidence, and confidence is a big deal. Here we go. This one's from Ed Rogers. I totally agree, man. I mean, if these guys are playing with confidence, knowing, look, it's not just about understanding the scheme and thinking, okay, I know what I'm supposed to do on this play, but having the mental wherewithal of saying, I've already done this. And in a game where literally the objective is to physically and mentally impose your will on your opponent, if you have any hesitation, it's really hard to do that, especially in a conference where you've got a lot of physically good, talented players. So confidence is huge. And, the further we get away from Minnesota and Oregon, probably the better, but also the further we get away from it, the more I reflect back and think, gee, I don't know if I love opening Ohio State's football schedule with, first of all, conference game, and then playing a team like Oregon without having played a Tulsa or an Akron or whatever early on. That makes it really tough. You can only play who's on your schedule, but what has happened to Ohio State, in weeks 3 and 4 has made a huge difference in the way that they seem like they're growing going forward. So I agree. Confidence is everything.
And confidence is not just an individual thing, right? Like it's not just like, oh, I'm confident in my own abilities. I think in a lot of ways, being confident in the other guy next to you is going to do his job with the same intensity and competency that you approach it is actually more important. And I think we've seen that in the past with guys maybe overcompensating because they don't necessarily trust some of the other guys out there. And I think that is maybe the biggest difference that I've seen with the defense now compared to, say, earlier in the season, that there's a lot more trust from each position group going back, obviously from the D-line all the way back into the secondary. There's a lot more trust among those guys now than there was at the start of the season. And I think you're seeing the results of that.
Okay, let's shift to, Michigan and Iowa and Penn State. Obviously, they've all gotten off to good starts. They've all looked a little bit different in the way they've gone about their solid starts to the season. Of those three, I think Iowa is the most for real. I don't think they're unbeatable by any stretch, but I've been really impressed with them, especially the way they cause turnovers. There's some weird stat out there. Like if you look back since 2017, Iowa's defense has caused more turnovers than any other Power 5 team in that stretch. And it's actually not that close. And then obviously what they just did to Maryland this past weekend further punctuates that. I'm not an X's and O's guy. That's why I try to bring other guys on that, that know that stuff like the back of their hand. But I know an aggressive defense when I see it, and I like what I see from Iowa this year. Penn State, I think, is a good team that had a crappy year last year, and I expected them to rebound. Are they a legit college football playoff contending team? I mean, I guess by the record and who they've beaten so far, you have to say yes. They beat Auburn at home. So that's got to count for something. They just whooped Indiana. So that's got to count for something. But I'm not ready to crown, Penn State by any stretch. And this is not a hate on Michigan fest. Okay. That's not my style, but I don't believe in the Wolverines yet. I think they have a much better defense. That their defense is absolutely taken a step forward this year. I can't get behind them yet offensively. They beat the crap out of Western Michigan and Northern Illinois. I don't care. They smoked Washington, who lost the week before to Montana, who's an FCS program. That win doesn't matter much to me. They snuck past Wisconsin. Like I think I know what the score said. I think Michigan was gifted 2 touchdowns against a Wisconsin offense that is atrocious. Wisconsin's defense is pretty good. Wisconsin's offense is horrendous. Michigan is a better football team than they were last year. They are a competent football team that has decent quarterback play that can run the ball effectively. I am not that worried about them yet as a Buckeye fan. I'm just not.
Yeah, I think I agree on all counts with Michigan. I think Penn State's probably the most dangerous because of Sean Clifford and his passing ability. And I really like their defense. I think their defensive line is underrated. You wonder a little bit about Penn State's ability to maybe grind out close games. Their running game is not super great. I think if you look at like that trio of coaches, Kirk Ferentz, James Franklin, Jim Harbaugh, I think I don't love any of them, if I'm being honest, but I think probably James Franklin is maybe the guy I would trust the most out of that group, which is maybe saying something.
I know you have a James Franklin love affair too.
Yeah, and I think if he was sitting right here with us, I think we could talk about that. And I covered Penn State for 2 years, and if you've watched us before, like you've heard, some of my opinions on that athletic department and how some of that is run. But the guy can still recruit his face off. And, say what you will about some of the in-game stuff and how dependent they are, essentially how dependent they are success-wise on the competency of their coordinators. But their OC is pretty darn good. And it's a guy that we've seen come through Columbus and do some nice things. So I think they're probably the most dangerous. I will never trust Iowa until proven otherwise. We're working on about 15 years of experience there. I've referenced it before, but I still will always refer to Kirk Ferentz as DB Cooper. And if you know who DB Cooper is, that's funny. And I don't trust them for a single second, not one bit. And I've said in the past, if you've read our game predictions, that Notre Dame are the biggest posers in college football. They're the biggest imposters in college football. If you're making like an NCAA tournament style, like seeding of big college football imposters, Notre Dame's the number 1 overall seed. You know who else is in the other 4 or the other 3? Iowa is an absolute lock for a 1 seed as imposter in college football. They've done nothing, absolutely nothing, and when it actually mattered. But that being said, if they maintain what they're doing, make the Big Ten championship game, and then beat whoever they're playing, which is probably going to be Ohio State, they deserve to go to the college football playoff. Sure. That won't happen, but that's real. But I definitely think Penn State's dangerous. I think if this was an even year where Ohio State had to go to Beaver Stadium and play in a whiteout, you'd be really looking at that game going like, oh man, if you're an Ohio State fan. But the fact that game will be at the Shoe, I think is a massive win for Ohio State as far as kind of shifting the balance before the ball even gets kicked. But yeah, I don't trust Michigan. I'll never trust Iowa, and I think Penn State's dangerous. So yeah, that's probably where I stand among those two teams. The other one, and I think we have to talk about them because the turnaround that they've made is such an unbelievable 180 that I don't think he's getting enough credit, and that's Sparty.
Yep.
And the physicality that they're playing with under Mel Tucker feels different. And some of the ways they've been able to win, talking different games, winning different ways, is good. And that is only good for the Big Ten going forward. That's a massive game for Ohio State because that will probably be a top 10 game coming up here a little bit later. I'm going to say maybe like a month or a little bit under a month.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's some big opponents and situations sitting in front of Ohio State that I think is huge opportunities for them to really showcase kind of some of the development and growth and changes that they've made.
I'm glad you brought up Michigan State because there's a whole bunch of comments on Sparty too. They are clearly a better running football team than they were last year. And you saw that right from week one when they rampaged Northwestern, which, by the way, I mean, Northwestern, for as good as they were last year, they, absolute value of good last year might be great or bad this year. Like, they're tough to watch, man.
Yeah.
Which I hate seeing because I think Pat Fitzgerald's a man. I absolutely love when they're good. Michigan State defensively, they're still averaging 427.8 yards allowed per game. That's not going to get it done. Let's see, yards per play. Michigan State is 48th in the country. They're allowing 5.11 yards per play. That metric's too high. They've got to figure out a way to bring that down. But I agree with you. They are certainly playing better football. But if they're going to stop an Ohio State offense that is literally on pace, and if you didn't see this, I wrote about this last night on BuckeyesNow.com. The Ohio State offense right now, sans Justin Fields, is on pace to break the all-time Big Ten record for most yards per game offensively in a season. And on top of leading, the conference in that stat, they lead the country in that stat with over 535 yards per game. And they lead the country in yards per play. The Buckeyes are averaging 8.5 yards per play. That's ridiculous. Last weekend, C.J. Stroud broke the Big Ten all-time record for freshman quarterbacks with 19.4 yards per completion. I mean, he just shredded the defense. Somebody defensively is going to have to figure out a way to make Ohio State's offense frustrated. And with the way they've grown these last couple weeks, again, I recognize the level of competition. The Buckeyes are going to start seeing some better defenses after the bye. But we've talked about confidence quite a bit here. You've got a redshirt freshman quarterback. You've got a running back who is a slam dunk first-team All-American already. And frankly, if Travion was carrying it 25 times a game, he might be in New York for a Heisman ceremony. The wide receiving crew might have 6 first-round draft picks in it. We've talked about the offensive line and how underappreciated Jeremy Ruckert is right now as a tight end. This unit is stupid good. And if somebody's going to beat the Buckeyes down the stretch and knock them out, they've got to play wicked good defense. I'm just not sold on Michigan State yet being able to do that.
No, and I think in general, it's a little bit like rating defenses on a macro level, I think, is a challenge. It's like, what do you look at? Do you look at total defense? Do you look at scoring defense? Do you look at turnover ratio? All of those things. And I think you could probably skew a little bit the stats your way to, kind of to support your argument. Right. And I think eye test wise, certainly Sparty has not maybe met that on defense, but I think in a lot of ways, they maybe don't have to because of their ability to run the football and to be able to control games with time of possession and really kind of dominate the clock. So, and to me, I think what they've done, as far as like buy-in is concerned with Mel Tucker and what they did last year and how different it looks this year and how quickly that turnaround happened, because that usually doesn't happen. It's, that a lot of times with massive regime change, it takes 2 or 3 years, because essentially you have to have the former coaches guys move on, and he's gotten guys who aren't necessarily his to buy in, and I think that's a pretty impressive thing. But I mean, defensively, they're just not on par with Ohio State as far as like stopping Ohio State's offense. But guess what? There are only maybe 2 other teams in the country that probably are.
Yeah, and give them credit. You're right. I mean, they have
it's grading on a scale, right? But in general, if you turn over Ohio State 2-3 times in a game, you could beat them. Like you know what I'm saying? So like it's more of it's a lot closer of a matchup than I think we ever would have imagined, when we were looking at the schedule in August.
Well, I mean, look at what Oregon did, right? Oregon didn't necessarily turn the Buckeyes over a bunch. They just stuffed Ohio State on 4th downs. Yeah. Ohio State's offense in that game was not the problem, even if C.J. Stroud was playing hurt. The offense kind of stopped themselves, and the defense was the real challenge in that game. Mm-hmm. Hey, I want to get to this. I really appreciate the super chat here. Thank you very much, Treasure the Torah. Want to say I like your philosophy and your honesty in today's time. That's rare. Peace and respect, my brother. Thank you. Really appreciate that. And thanks for your support. We certainly love covering the Buckeyes as thoroughly as we can. And means a lot that you guys are all involved in these chats.
Keep them coming. We love that. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like we love talking to each other, and we do it all the time. But I think it's also nice to have we are firmly kind of ensconced in this college football bubble, and that's just kind of the nature of how we do this, right? But it's also really important to always have perspective from outside of that, and I think that's where the comments really are massive. Because it gives us, in a lot of ways, a fuller picture of not just what Ohio State's doing on the field and what the coaches and players are saying, but also how fans are looking at that. And I don't think you're unable to get a clear picture of everything that's going on without that perspective.
And I just want to point this out. It's a natural spot to do this here. We post all of our podcasts after the fact. So if you miss these live, obviously you can watch them on our YouTube channel. We certainly appreciate that there. But, if you're driving or you're on a run or you're walking the dog or whatever, and you don't want to watch the video component, we post our podcast on lots of different audio platforms as well. So know that if you are listening for the first time on that spot, you can interact with us. And we do want your comments and your thoughts, because that's what makes these shows really fun. We don't approach this from a talking heads perspective. We like, understanding and thinking and feeling what you think and feel, and want to try to address the things that excite you or frustrate you, because we feel a lot of that stuff too, and that's really important to us. All right, let's talk here about Oregon. There's a part of me that felt going into this past week, Brett, that the Buckeyes needed Oregon to win out. There's a part of me that felt like if you're the Buckeyes and you're trying to make the playoff, you need to have a loss that looks as good as it can. It's early in the season when your team is really young and you happen to lose to a team that, if they win out and they make the playoff, that's as good as it can get, right? If you're Georgia or Alabama, and let's try to project this forward, obviously, nothing's guaranteed, but man, if Alabama doesn't play Georgia in the SEC title game, something wild happens.
Right.
And I don't care who loses that game, as long as it's a reasonably competitive game. They both belong in the college football playoff. The quality of your loss should matter. However, winning and only knowing that you can beat the teams that are actually on your schedule, because that's all you can control, that has to matter first and foremost. And if there's any sliver of a doubt between Oregon and Ohio State and the resumes are similar, Oregon's going to get in. They beat the Buckeyes. That's it. I mean, the whole point is to have head-to-head matchups. You want to earn your way into the playoff. So if it's close and there's one spot, the Buckeyes are out of luck. But if Oregon would have won out, and I'm hanging on to the hope that, Oklahoma looks vulnerable, I think the Buckeyes would get in the playoff ahead of an unbeaten Cincinnati team if Ohio State at the end of the year can beat Penn State and Michigan and potentially Iowa. I think that would be enough to get the Buckeyes in. But now that Oregon has lost, what do you think? Does that help or hurt Ohio State's playoff chances?
I think it hurts. And we've talked about this in the past that, like, if head-to-head matchups don't carry massive, overwhelming weight, in some ways, what are we even doing here?
Sure.
And I think, we can talk a little bit about, essentially what was like an extremely confusing performance from them in that Stanford game. And like, not only were they beaten by, in my mind, like not a very good team, but they actually looked like bad at times in that game. It was very weird. But I think in terms of, how it affects essentially Ohio State, like I think the rule of thumb is never be ranked above the team you lost to, right? And Ohio State is right now. They're 7, Oregon's 8. And so that's not good. Like the flat out, that's just not good. I think if you're looking at Oregon's schedule the rest of the way out, you're looking a little bit at that trip to UCLA and wondering if Chip Kelly can put it together there. But essentially, if you're an Ohio State fan, you're absolutely rooting for Oregon to lose another game. And
at this point, yeah, you have to.
Because, like, if it's like you want the loss to look as good as you possibly can. Well, not anymore. Now you want Oregon to look bad and lose another game at least. Because you have to essentially take that tiebreaker, if you will, off the board. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of the nature of the beast a little bit with, the idea of, because of the 14 playoff, you're essentially operating without a safety net. And, and you have to pretty much run the table to remove any doubt. And so, I think, if Ohio State beats everyone they're supposed to beat, they go to the Big Ten title game and beat whoever that might be, probably getting in. And I think that's like the Virginia Tech rule, right? From whenever they lost to the Hokies at home. Well, boom, there's a comment right there.
Well, and so this comment I think is interesting because I don't know if I quite see it that way about Virginia Tech's record. For me, the reason why Ohio State got in to the college football playoff in the end of the 2014 season was because they got clearly better as the season went along. And in the biggest game against a very good Wisconsin team, they absolutely pounded Wisconsin. I mean, they looked like they played a different sport than Wisconsin played when they shut them out. They essentially took the decision out of the committee's hands and basically said, we can't afford to not put a team in that just shut out a legitimately good nationally ranked opponent in their conference championship game when they've clearly been getting better all season long. I don't think it was necessarily because of Virginia Tech's record being bad. It was because Ohio State got that good as the year went along.
For sure. And I think, at the time, that OSU Wisconsin game, I think, was the highest rated TV ratings wise game in OSU history outside of, national championship games. But obviously I think it came on the heels of smashing Michigan, the week before. So it was two high profile, tons of eyeballs games where Ohio State just stomped on a team that everybody was kind of thinking had an opportunity or a chance to win. And Ohio State showed that they had absolutely zero. And so I think we look at that as kind of like essentially the blueprint. And I think everyone in college football does this. They look at that Ohio State team as the blueprint for getting in after losing early in the season, in that you progress, you get better. And then when the games towards the end of the season that everybody's watching, you blow people out. And because of, like it or not, recency bias plays a massive factor in, both the rankings, the playoff rankings, and then absolutely the selection. And so, that's a huge factor, and I think it's important. But I think if we're kind of circling all of this back to Oregon, that the loss to Stanford is not good, but in many ways, none of that matters. The loss doesn't, whatever Oregon does the rest of the year does not matter if Ohio State does not continue to play well and get better. And I think that's absolutely, absolutely huge for Ohio State. And that, I think, is all they can really consider.
Ed says that Michigan game was close, wasn't it? It was 42-28 that year. Competitive, certainly not what it was the last 2 years, but still it was a decisive Ohio State win. Some interesting talk here about playoff expansion, lots of stuff here within the chat. And I don't know if I'm on board with a 12 to 16 team playoff. I think that might be too many.
It'll never happen either, because you would have to eliminate a lot of the bowls and to be able to do that.
And at that level, you'd probably start eliminating regular season games, because teams, if you need to win 4 playoff games to win the national title, that's going to start adding way too many games on the schedule. I've always been a proponent of this. I'm willing to listen to other points of view. You got 5 Power 5 leagues in every other sport at every other level of college athletics. If you win your conference championship, you get an automatic bid to play in the national tournament. Why that doesn't exist in college football doesn't make sense to me. I've listened to arguments. I've heard people say that, do the 5th and 6th best teams or 7th and 8th best teams in the country really have a chance to win the national championship? I don't care. The whole point is they get a chance to play for it. It's what we love about college sports. It's literally what we love about March Madness. This is an Ohio State channel. It's what college basketball fans love about Oral Roberts beating the Buckeyes, and why it sucked as an Ohio State fan to lose to Oral Roberts. How many people had never heard of Oral Roberts University before that tournament started? It was an incredible moment, right? If you're Cincinnati and you run the table, I think you deserve a chance to get in. I don't think they're going to get in unless all hell breaks loose in front of them. But I think if you win one of the Power 5 leagues, you should get an automatic berth. If you are the best group of 5 team in the country, go play Alabama. Go play the number 1 team in the country. Line up, and you might get whacked, but you might not. Right? I mean, Cincinnati should have beaten Georgia last year. I realize it's not the exact same Georgia team, but they should have beaten Georgia last year. They totally just, blew that game at the end. I am of the opinion that it should be an 8-team playoff where your 5 Power 5 conference champions get in, your best group of 5 team in the country gets in, and then you have basically 2 at-large spots, because it's so hard to win your conference. And if you don't win, I don't think that should necessarily exclude you from the conversation. I think it would be so much more fun. You're only adding for the 2 teams that win the national championship game, you're only adding, or I should say that get to the national championship game, you're only adding 1 game to the calendar for 2 teams, right? It's not like you're adding a whole bunch of games for a whole bunch of schools. So I have been fully on board with an 8-team playoff for a long time. I just want to get away from 4. 6 would be fine. 8 would be terrific. I think beyond that, it gets watered down a little bit and it's unnecessary, but we need playoff expansion. We've needed it for 7 years.
Yeah. I think the concept of like correlation not equaling causation is important to remember. That, like, if Cincinnati gets in, that's right.
Thank you, Max Asmus, for doing that again.
Yeah. Shout out, Max. The idea that, like, if Cincinnati gets in and they gets pounded by Alabama, that doesn't mean they didn't deserve to get in, right? And I think we've seen that multiple times. That is not necessarily confirmation that the playoff does it the right way or whatever. So, you know, I think I've loved the idea of 5 autos and 5 automatic berths, and then the 6th being like a non-Power 5 team, or if that team doesn't necessarily exist, another Power 5 team that maybe loses a conference championship. And essentially there being a ranking and selection for that final spot. I think that's fine. I also like it because I think it gives you the top 2. It gives essentially teams, incentive to be in those top 2 spots, because then you give those teams buys in the first round of the tournament, and so that they're not necessarily playing an extra game. But I think in general, it's essentially, I think at the core of the conversation and debate, nothing changes with however many teams are getting in. Essentially, what we're talking about are like, who's going to be that 3rd or 4th team. Well, if we add 2 more teams to that equation, now we're talking about who are the 5th and 6th teams that are getting in. If you add 8, it's who's going to be 7 and 8. Like the debate and conversation doesn't necessarily change.
Yeah, and I don't think it waters down the product either. I agree. Right. It just changes about who's the last team that's going to get in, but there's going to be some really, really good quality teams that should have a chance to play for the national title that aren't going to get a chance.
And I think that we're also talking about a little bit the difference between football and basketball, right? That sure. I think when you get beyond 8 teams, an 8th, for example, like an 8-seeded whatever team might be, like, let's say it's 8-seeded like UCF, and they're maybe a good example. That team is never running the gauntlet, if you will, winning 3 games to win a national championship. That's just never going to happen. And so the idea of like that maybe diluting the product, I think I'd be willing to listen to. But would you say it's not fun to be able to have that opportunity?
Of course.
Absolutely. Right. And I think at its core, what we're talking about is essentially the idea of, are we protecting, if you will, protecting? And I think that's the operative word here.
Yeah.
Are we protecting these teams, these blue bloods, if you will, for consistently winning national championships? Because essentially we're not asking them to play enough games to be able to do it. And I think that actually is an important kind of part of the conversation. So 100% it needs to be bigger in my mind, as far as the expansion is concerned. But once you get beyond, say, like 6 to 8 teams, I think then it's unnecessarily complicated.
Yeah, no, that's definitely fair. Beyond 8, again, I would listen to 6. I'd probably be okay with 6, but I think the idea of earning an at-large bid would be a lot of fun, and I'll be curious to see how they address that moving forward. I want to address something that Ohio State fans yesterday just torched. RJ Young, who's a Fox Sports college football guy. I haven't met him. I don't know much about him. I've certainly seen some of the stuff that he's done on Fox's platform.
One thing we know about RJ, homeboy has the password to the Fox Sports Twitter handle. Nobody retweeting himself more than that guy.
He, I appreciate bold, right? I don't like highly fabricated, flowery BS, right? If you're going to have an opinion, that's fine. Back it up with fact and explain why you feel a certain way. So I'm good with him doing his own thing and putting his own poll out there and saying, hey, this is what I think. Did you see his poll before I go down this road here?
I'm pulling it up. I'm trying to figure out.
He put the Buckeyes 17th in the country, and the 5th ranked team was BYU. Coastal Carolina was ahead of Ohio State. He basically did it off of a raw winning percentage and essentially said, hey, look, winning matters, and then who you beat matters and who you lost to matters. And if you're Ohio State, don't lose to a team that just lost to Stanford. I just think that's stupid. We don't live in a vacuum where every opponent is created exactly equal, right? If Ohio State loses to Oregon, that shouldn't be weighed the same as, Florida and Kentucky, where Florida just lost to the Wildcats, at the end of the game there. And the idea of ranking Ohio State 17th in the country, to me, was just dumb. Now, I don't know if he was looking for clicks. I don't know if he was just trying to rile people up. I understand what he was saying, but to me, it brought about a point that I think is worth discussing, and that is what is actually on your schedule, because it's the only thing you can control. Like, if you're looking for a win that could put you over the hump, maybe you can't get it because you're not playing against a team that is, that caliber. It's part of the reason why the scheduling process has kind of gotten out of control the way that it has, where, Ohio State's got opponents scheduled 10 years out now, because you're trying to put some good non-conference games on your calendar. But by the same token, the best you can do is play the teams that are in front of you. And I just don't think we live in a world where all opponents are created equal and we're in this vacuum and every loss is the same or every win is the same. But I mean, there were obviously some things in that poll that, to me, I was like, really? BYU and Coastal Carolina ahead of Ohio State? I think the Buckeyes would play them on the moon, blindfolded, and beat them by 50. Like, thanks for playing.
Yeah, I mean, probably. I mean, I think in general, it's probably the Stephen A. Smith / Skip Bayless rule of sports talk, where it's like, what's the scenario, and then the most outrageous thing I can say, and then we'll put that out there, and I will reap the financial benefits of it. And Skip and Stephen A. have laughed all the way to the bank on that one for the better part of a decade, and continue to do so. And I mean, and I'm not saying RJ's doing that, and I think it's important to say that, and not having actually read the reasoning behind why he did what he did. So I said what he said. So I'm not really interested or comfortable even like commenting on it. But I think I'm always interested in perspective, right? I think, for me as a person and just my personality, I really like hearing why you should look at things differently. And so I can maybe be a bit of an iconoclast in that, what a lot of times in my feeling, like what is convention is like I kind of feel a lot of times do opposite. So, I kind of like the idea of essentially there being like a very simple rubric and how you then judge teams based on that very simple rubric, all things being equal, is interesting. And I think that's a fun conversation to have. And I think at best, that's kind of the whole thing of what we're doing, is essentially like, are we having a good time talking and debating about this? And are you doing it in good faith? And I think that's what makes college football and college sports special and different than pro sports, right? I'm always eager for that kind of content and that kind of way of augmenting like the greater conversation and discussion. I don't think I think we can all agree that probably Coastal Carolina is not better than Ohio State and probably shouldn't be ranked above them. But like, I'm willing to hear why you think that. Absolutely. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, the whole conversation is essentially, are ratings / rankings even important in October, right? Why do they matter?
Well, that's why the College Football Playoff Committee doesn't put out their rankings until, much later in the year. The AP poll and the coaches poll are basically just talk fodder. I mean,
I think they're remnants of a system that we no longer use, right? And so, I think I think it's great for people like us. I think they're great reference points. But as far as like how much they actually tangibly matter at this point in the season, it's probably not that much.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Look, we've got a long time here. What final thoughts do you have before maybe we wrap up?
I still remain that you should never trust Iowa until proven otherwise. And we're talking about a decade's worth of evidence behind that point. If you're a Hawkeyes fan, respect, man. I love what you do and how you support that program. Kinnick is an unbelievable place to experience it. If you've never seen a game there, absolutely go. It's a top 5 college football atmosphere in the country. Your coach is still DB Cooper, and you should probably stop paying him. But in general, I think this is the closest thing we've gotten to Chaos Elmo in college football in a very long time. And the more of it, the better. I welcome it with open arms because it's the best way and the best situation in which we get to talk about it. So more chaos, please.
Well, you've got a pretty good chance to have a lot of chaos.
Word.
Had one more question that we wanted to get to here. Let's see. Eyes Open says, if Georgia or Alabama completely blows out the other in the SEC championship game, should the loser get in? I think it kind of depends on what everything else looks like. But my gut says that's one, pretty unlikely to happen. But two, I think right now those two teams are on such a different level that if they get knocked down to a level where you're looking at one-loss teams, if your one loss is to either Alabama or Georgia, depending on which team it is, and you've smashed everybody else that you've played, it's kind of hard to keep them out. Now, I don't know if that means they would be the number 2 seed in the college football playoff. But I think it's extremely likely that both of those teams make the college football playoff, even if that SEC title game turns into a blowout. I just kind of have a hard time seeing that happen.
I would say I don't love the idea of that game not mattering, right?
Sure.
Essentially, so like that's essentially what we're talking about is like, does the SEC championship game matter when both teams are getting in, no matter the result? And that I think is maybe not a good idea. If essentially the idea is this is a game that you're playing to prevent from playing the exact same game in the opening round of the playoff, as opposed to getting the 2 seed, and playing going 2-3-1-4, that I think is important. But I think it also depends upon what the other teams, and that are projected in that 3-4 spot, and even beyond 5, into 6, right? But yeah, I would think they probably get in for sure.
I mean, think about it, right? The teams right now that have one loss that could be in that conversation: the Buckeyes, Oregon, Notre Dame, Arkansas, Ole Miss. I guess at the moment that's all it is, but somewhere along the way, Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State physically can't all go undefeated because they play each other. So at least another of those 2 teams is going to end up with a loss. And potentially Iowa, and then the loser of that game. I think the loser of that game ends up having a better resume than all of those other teams. So It's my opinion that, yes, they're going to get in. But we still got half the season to go, so we'll see what happens.
Right. Essentially, like the idea is is a one-loss SEC runner-up getting in over a one-loss Big Ten runner-up or an undefeated Cincinnati. And what we've seen over the course of the college football playoff, the answer to that question is yes, and has been yes basically every time. Whether that should be
that's a different debate.
Is a different conversation, right? But like with the context of this season, what we've seen so far, and what I think we're going to see, between now and that SEC title game, there's the loser of that game is getting in pretty much 100%.
RK says, any word on Simon? We will ask tomorrow when we have Ryan Day's press conference. I'm sure he'll probably be asked several times, several different ways. But we don't have anything yet on Cody. Tomorrow's Mondays are essentially like an off day for media and for the team. And then Tuesday is where things, really dive back in and the attention gets swung to the upcoming opponent. So Ryan Day's press conference is at 12 noon. We will stream that live for you right here on our YouTube channel. You can certainly check that out. We'll also have plenty of content around that if you miss it live over on our website, BuckeyesNow.com. we'll continue to talk along the way about all the stuff here that is relevant nationally and relevant to the Buckeyes. This is turning into another fun season. You know, you like the fact that teams look different every year. It's part of what's fun about college football. And the Ohio State team that took the field September 2nd up at Minnesota and September 11th against Oregon, to me, it looks a heck of a lot different right now than they did just a few weeks ago. And it is my hope that they will continue to get better and look even that much better, especially on the defensive side of the ball as the season rolls along. Maryland this week, then a bye, and then Indiana. These are three big weeks coming up. 2 of them because you got games, and 1 week because, darn it, you need to get healthy in the middle of the year. And that bye week, I think, might just come at a really good time for the Buckeyes. So thanks, everybody.
Bye week, a.k.a. fall wedding season in the greater state of Ohio.
Can I just make a comment since you've brought that up? My younger brother is getting married on our bye week, and he didn't choose that date because it was the bye week. He's not a diehard Ohio State football fan. But when I found out that was the day his wedding was, I'm telling you, I gave him like the biggest hug of all time. Thank you. I wasn't going to miss your wedding, but I really didn't want to have to miss a game. I appreciate that you worked around my schedule, Patrick. So
one of the best days in Central Ohio in the entire year is the Ohio State bye weekend. And I would encourage people to do this because I've done it with my friends in the past. You go out right around like noonish, and you in the greater like downtown Columbus area, and you count the number of wedding parties you see. And it'll get up there. It'll get up there. And it's a good time. Trust me. It's good stuff.
Love it. For Brett Hiltbrand, I'm Brendan Gulick. This is Buckeye Breakdown. Ohio State getting ready for Maryland this week after a big win over Rutgers this past weekend. Please check out all of our stuff over on BuckeyesNow.com, and we'd be really grateful if you'd subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for such an interactive audience this afternoon. We'll see you again real soon.
We've got the whole crew together as we cover Ohio State with our instant analysis from Ohio State. There's something that doesn't feel right. Unbelievable effort from him today.
He's got to make plays, and the linebacker group has got to play better.
This was not a comfortable game by any stretch of the imagination. He seems to have the durability. He certainly has the toughness. It is quarterback Justin Fields. I think this is kind of an interesting spot for him to be drafted.
There has never been a situation quite like this before.
At midcourt, inside it, at the buzzer, got it!
Selection Sunday is finally here. Is E.J. Liddell going to crack the first team All-Big Ten? I'm not trying to start a quarterback controversy, but I don't think he can be the guy. It's obvious that he's got this opportunity. This is the question on a lot of people's minds here.
Welcome to Buckeye Breakdown.